Okay, hello. I'm Keith Frankish. I was until recently a senior lecturer with the Open University in the UK, and I'm currently a visiting senior research fellow there. I'm also an adjunct professor with the Brain and Mind program at the University of Crete in, in Greece. And I'm speaking to you today from Crete, so perhaps this is the first Hellenic contribution to Philosophy TV.
Yes, try not to give Cretans any more of a bad name.
Well, I'm only semi-Cretan, so
Right,
just some
right.
of the things that I say are lies. Um,
Okay.
okay, now I'm a philosopher of psychology, and my main research interests are in mental architecture. I'm particularly interested in dual process theories of reasoning and dual attitude theories of belief. But I also have interests in consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, and I've written a textbook on consciousness, and I've also written some research papers on this. And I've recently finished a paper on qualia, which I think we're going to be talking about
Yeah.
today. Okay, so that's me. Richard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Hi, I'm Richard Brown. I'm an assistant professor at LaGuardia Community College, which is part of the City University of New York, where I earned my PhD in 2008 at the Graduate Center. I'm interested in foundations of cognitive science, philosophy of cognitive science, and philosophy of consciousness. I spend a lot of time thinking about consciousness and the way it's related to the brain. So those are the main issues that I'm interested in. I also have background interests in philosophy of language and metaethics. Actually, I wrote my dissertation on metaethics, but
Oh,
I got caught up in these debates about zombies and consciousness. So that's where I spend my time nowadays. So that's us, and I guess we're going to be here talking about qualia and physicalism. So I thought we might start by having you, Keith, go ahead and say a little bit about what qualia are, why we might be interested in them.
yeah, sure. Well, there are lots of puzzling things about consciousness. Lots of things that need explaining if we're to explain conscious experience. Now, they're all pretty difficult in one way or another. We need to explain the discriminatory abilities that go along with consciousness, the reactive dispositions that people have. We need to look at the neurology of consciousness. And there are many, many, many puzzling and deeply interesting questions on which progress is being made slowly. But the thing that is particularly troubling from a philosophical perspective, from the perspective of the metaphysics of mind, is the phenomenal aspect of consciousness, what's sometimes called qualia. And this is what provokes the deep philosophical discussions. This is the source of the so-called hard problem of consciousness in David Chalmers' term. And this, I guess, is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, so what do we mean by qualia? Well, I'm not a historian of philosophy, but I'll give you a sort of brief introduction to this.
Okay.
The notion that the use of the term qualia in the modern sense seems to be due to C.I. Lewis. That's Clarence Irving Lewis, I think. And he introduced the term to refer to the intrinsic, ineffable, essentially private subjective properties. Now, he thought of these properties as properties of sense data, of the objects of experience. But sense data theory is not much in fashion nowadays, and people tend to think of qualia as properties of experiences themselves. So, on this conception, there is an intrinsic, ineffable, essentially private, directly introspectable property of experience, is the feel of the experience. And this I call this conception classic qualia. Classic both because it seems to be the traditional one, though some people might dispute that, and also because it's the strong concept. It's the sort of the max concept. There's an implicit soft drink metaphor going off in my discussions of this. So at the risk of mixing brands, you might call them qualia max.
Right.
Now, I don't think classic qualia are too much in favour nowadays. Certainly not with physicalists. They certainly don't look like they're going to yield very easily to reductive explanation. If they're intrinsic means non-functional, non-representational, not relationally defined, then it's hard to see how the standard reductive strategies can get any kind of grip on them. They're ineffable, so you can't say much about them. You can't characterise them directly.
Right.
They're essentially private, so it looks like science is going to have a bit of a problem getting to grips with them. And Daniel Dennett did a pretty good hatchet job, I think, on classic qualia in his 1998 paper, Quining Qualia. Quining means denying to exist. So I think classic qualia have rather fallen out of favour. Of course, some people do think that classic qualia exist, but they think they have to argue for that. They can't just take it for granted that classic qualia exist. Okay, so Richard, are you with me so far?
Yeah, I'm absolutely with you. You know, I just wanted to make a couple of quick notes about what you said. First, I think it's interesting just from the historical standpoint that the focus on qualia is really something that's modern. Excuse me, I mean contemporary. So modern being, if we date modern from Descartes, Descartes, though he was a dualist, wasn't really concerned as much about qualia as modern contemporary philosophers are. In fact, he thought it was more basic mental functioning that was the problem for a materialistic theory of it. For instance, he thought that language use or thought in general couldn't be explained mechanically. So it's interesting that as we've seen the sort of advance of computer science and cognitive science, that worry has kind of fallen away, and instead there's the issue of these intrinsic, subjective, private, subjective raw feels, or whatever terminology you want to use. That's become the main focus.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, they're the last bastion of the deep mystery of the mind, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. So that's where everything has, and you can see the beginning of that in the Cartesian Galilean kind of view, where they have experiences as private, but they weren't so as much baffled by those as they were by the mental functioning in general. So
they have plenty more to baffle them.
Yeah, right.
We've less to baffle us, so we focus on the things that are left.
I guess that's right. So so the contemporary focus on qualia and even that term, as you mentioned, is a very contemporary term.
Absolutely.
I think it's a bit, well, I'll foreshadow something that might come up later. I think it's a bit hasty at this point to say that the classic qualia can't be naturalized. I agree intuitively they don't seem the kind of thing that can be naturalized, but I take it that a lot of type B physicalists, and we'll maybe talk about them later, but those kinds of people will say that's exactly what we're going to do, is naturalize them in some sense by discovering that they're just identical to certain brain states. So that might be one kind of way to explore, but we'll say more, but it certainly does seem at first blush that classic qualia are very hard to fit into the naturalistic framework.
And I think for that reason, a lot of people don't want to assume that classic qualia exist. I mean, even if you're a dualist, you perhaps don't want to assume that they exist, to start with the presumption that they exist. Otherwise, it might look as if you're begging the question against your opponents.
Right.
You're starting with the conception that they can't possibly handle, or that it's very difficult for them to handle.
Right.
So maybe start with something a little weaker, and then argue for the existence of classic qualia.
Well, that's right, and so that's going to be the main strategies we're going to be quining on here in a second. Absolutely. But I just wanted to say one other thing, which is you mentioned Dennett and quining qualia, and so quining is a word that I think famously Dennett made up, right, in the Philosopher's Lexicon. Was that owing to him? I'm not exactly sure. But it doesn't merely mean to deny the existence of
Yeah, absolutely.
It means he jokingly said it meant to deny the existence of something that was obvious.
That obviously does exist.
Yeah, right. So, and I think that's important because the feeling is that qualia do absolutely exist in some sense, and maybe we have to weaken it, like you said, so that we don't beg the question against any particular metaphysical view. But I think that Dennett was recognizing that there is a strong tendency to think that these things are there. When we do introspect our experience, we do seem to have access in a special way. I mean, so I like to talk about the itch on your back when you're trying to get someone to scratch it. You can't explain where the itch is in any real direct sense. The other person can't access where the itchiness is located on your back or seemingly located. And so it does seem as though there is this dimension of our experience that only we have access to, that I can't really express completely verbally, and which does seem to be sort of just simple when you sort of have an itchy experience and direct your mind towards it. There just seems to be an itchiness there, and doesn't seem to be much more that you can say about it from the first person, except to maybe contrast it or compare it with other kinds of experiences. It's more like this kind of experience and less like that kind of experience. Sure. So I just wanted to point out at the beginning that even though there have been philosophical attacks on qualia as classically conceived, they are encasing or sort of enclosing some pretty strong intuitions, which I think most people can come to appreciate from their own experience. So I'm always very suspicious of people who say they don't really know, why people would say these kinds of things. Well, if you just naively reflect on your experience, these are the kinds of things you might end up saying. So I just wanted to throw a pitch in for the common sensiness of classic qualia before we start dissecting it.
Absolutely, and of course Dennett would agree with everything you've just said. He thinks we have these intuitions. He shares them. He thinks they're very important facts about us.
Right.
He just doesn't trust them.
Right. Exactly. And so, in a true Quinean kind of spirit, you might say these are important heuristics for someone like Dennett, but they don't lead to theory, as Quine put it once. They don't lead to theory building. Rather, they're just a way of to sort of get a grip on what we're interested in or something. Absolutely. But we need to build a theory in another way. Yeah,
absolutely. So it's open to offer a theory that doesn't use those concepts.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So so that's classic qualia, and if we sort of assume that there's a problem fitting them into the naturalistic worldview, then they're assuming their existence seems question-begging. So recently in the literature, what you see is of people moving away from classic qualia and focusing on something that you call diet qualia. So do you want to say something about what diet qualia are?
Yeah. Well, diet qualia are meant to be a more neutral notion. So by diet qualia, people mean, well, of course, they don't use the term diet qualia. There's a variety of terminology that is used, but people often use phenomenal character, phenomenal feel, or just what it is likeness. The idea is that there is some sort of qualitative aspect to our experience that is introspectable. The experience is like something. Now, this property, this feel, this what it is likeness, might not ultimately be intrinsic, ineffable, subjective, and so on. It may seem to be, but it may turn out not to be. It may turn out to be just an ordinary property of the brain. That's a functional, representational property, neurological property that is completely effable, objectively inspectable, and so on. So what we need to start with is just the simple, apparently uncontroversial claim that our experiences have this phenomenal aspect. And we don't build into our conception of what needs explaining the idea that these things are intrinsic, ineffable, and subjective.
Right.
And this seems kind of like a nice way to go, because our experiences do seem to be like something, to have a qualitative aspect. And then if you think that this qualitative aspect is to be explained in terms of classic qualia, then you can go on to argue that these phenomenal fields really are intrinsic, ineffable, and so on. And if you want to go in another direction, you can argue that that they're not, and that they're explainable, reductively explainable in physical terms. So it seems we've got a neutral position here, which is just the sort of starting point we want.
Right.
And so I guess that's a move you think is it's certainly a common move. I mean, the
Yes.
terminology that is used varies. Some people use the term qualia just for classic qualia, and prefer to talk of phenomenal character for the diet notion, for
Right.
the neutral notion. Some people do the opposite. David Chalmers, for example, uses the word qualia just for phenomenal character, for what I'm calling diet qualia. So it's a little confusing, but as long as we make the distinction, I don't think there's a problem.
Right, and I think you're absolutely right that this is the move that people make in the literature now. In fact, I mean, it's almost been put, well, not almost. In fact, David Chalmers has said things like, "You're not taking phenomenal consciousness seriously as a theorist, unless you endorse some notion like what you call the diet qualia
Absolutely.
notion."
Yeah.
So if you deny that there is even something like this thin diet notion, then you're not even talking about consciousness anymore. To put the terminology in Ned Block's terminology, you might be confusing access consciousness with phenomenal consciousness. So you're just missing the target phenomena altogether. And I think that feeling does unite a lot of people working in this area, both physicalists, people like, I mean, Ned Block is something like an identity theorist or a biological theorist, as he prefers to call it, and dualists alike, property dualists like Chalmers as well. They both think that, well, if you're going to really be working on the issue, on the problem, the thing that we're all trying to figure out, then you need to start with some notion like diet qualia, that what its likeness of experience can't be denied. That seems to be, and that was what I was sort of talking about at the beginning, is this this strong intuition that philosophers have that phenomenal consciousness is sort of obvious. As Bloch said, if I have to explain it to you, then you're not going to know, riffing on the Louis Armstrong thing. So it's not something that can be defined. It's like, it's just, we just say, well, you have to know it from your own first person experience and hope that the other person does. So I think it's ubiquitous, actually. And I mean, in your paper, you provide compelling quotes, but I mean, I think we can multiply those almost one per philosopher working in this area at this point.
I think yes, and it's taken to be almost completely uncontroversial, and I don't know of anyone who really argues for this. It's just taken as a starting point.
Yeah.
It's often said that it's undeniable that diet qualia exist.
Right.
Although I take it that type A materialists might want to differ on that.
Yeah, and there's I don't want to say a growing movement, but there is a disturbing undercurrent of philosophers who are out and saying that they are in fact zombies. So I don't know if you are aware of this or not, but
not phenomenally.
Okay.
Yes, I might align myself with this disturbing undercurrent.
Yes, I was afraid that you might say that. So that's something we're going to talk about later. But yeah, so I mean,
I have a strong intuition that I'm not, but I don't trust it.
Right, and I think that's one of the main motivations for people saying these kinds of things is that
exactly.
Once they start really getting into the meat of the zombie argument, they come to realize there's nothing that I wouldn't say that the zombie wouldn't say, and then you get into this really disturbing spiral of, well, then how do I rule out that I'm not a zombie? Whereas, of course, the other side has always just sort of started with the intuitive obviousness of our non-zombiness. And so this might ultimately just be terminological and a rhetorical move, but we'll have to see what that comes to. But I merely wanted to point out that the type A materialist is not gone. There are people simply saying, look, we don't have consciousness in the sense that you're talking about, and if that makes us zombies by your lights, then so be it. We're still the same as we were yesterday.
Yeah, I've been known to say that, yes. I mean, yeah, so essentially, I guess what I'm doing in the paper really, and is look, as we discussed earlier with classic qualia, there's a move there. You can say, well, okay, look, it seems that we have classic qualia. I have this very strong intuition that I do, and
Right.
all kinds of things that I say and assume this intuition. But I don't really trust it when I'm doing, when I'm theorizing. I treat this intuition skeptically, and I find that I can actually build a better theory of mind without it. And so I guess I'm just saying the same thing about the direct qualia intuition. Yes, I have it. And yes, there's all kinds of things that I say that betray that intuition, but I don't really trust it. I don't think we should trust it when we're doing either psychology or metaphysics of mind.
Right. And that's the interesting thing, I think, is why we ought not to trust it. I mean, it's interesting to me that when I was an undergraduate, when I first was introduced to Descartes, we were assigned an essay. They said the professor said to try to think of something that Descartes didn't doubt. Yeah, did he doubt everything? Did he really? Because he was trying to doubt as much as he could. So is there maybe something that he should have doubted that he didn't? And I was just also happened to be learning about the zombie arguments and et cetera in my philosophy of mind class, and I was struck by the fact that Descartes never for once entertained that he didn't have conscious experience. That was, in fact, that's the sort of bedrock of the cogito, is that his experience is there, and so I was sort of struck by this, that, well, he doubted everything except maybe he never came up with the idea that he might be a zombie. And so in some sense, people are, our contemporaries are even engaged in a much more radical kind of doubt, it seems to me, than Descartes ever engaged in. And I mean, I personally find it implausible. Let's put it this way. So I understand conceptually that, well, if this turned out to be the zombie world, right? If we sort of zoomed out, metaphysically speaking, and in reality, this was a world where there was no consciousness, and we would still be having this debate. I would still feel just as passionately that I do have conscious experience. You would still feel as passionately that you seem to have conscious experience, but you don't trust it. And so I guess in some sense you can imagine a scenario, you can come up with a kind of hypothesis where you do lack conscious experience, and yet you say things and think the things that you are thinking right now. So I guess in that sense, it's perfectly conceivable that we're zombies. And I guess that's the intuition that you can't get around. Is that right?
I think. Let me just as you were saying that, it occurred to me. How do you feel about eliminative materialism with regard to other mental attitudes?
Right. I'm not a big fan of it.
You're not a big fan of it. Do you have more of a problem with consciousness than with beliefs and desires?
As far as eliminating it?
Yeah, I mean, I take it this is when another thing Descartes didn't doubt was that he had beliefs and desires and thoughts. And so
That's
on.
right.
Of course,
yeah.
There's quite an interesting argument for the view that we don't have beliefs and desires, that they're theoretical entities, theoretical posits that don't pick out anything real.
Right. Yeah. No. I guess I've.
I mean, do you think there's a bigger problem stomaching eliminativism about consciousness than stomaching eliminativism about beliefs and desires?
Actually, that's a good question. I think they're equally unstomachable. I mean, look, I this isn't an argument. I know that, but I've just spent too much time in New York, I guess, and around Fodor. But I mean, it just seems ludicrous that I don't have beliefs and desires. It seems obvious that I do to me, because I believe various things and desire them. But I mean, I recognize the theoretical possibility that that these intuitions are produced simply by by a theory for folk psychology, and that might come to be replaced. And I mean, you do see encroachments already on folk psychology when people talk about, for instance, when they say my brain hurts, and after they've learned something new or something. So we're already sort of supplementing folk psychology with neuroanatomical terms. But I don't think you're ever going to eliminate the propositional attitudes. I just don't think that's going to happen. But that's an empirical claim. I mean, I'm on board
Absolutely,
with that.
that's the important thing. I mean, you're happy that it's in the realm of the empirical.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what about consciousness?
I feel right. I guess so. If you want to, I feel less sure that that's in the realm of the empirical, or that could be empirically falsified.
Right. I think I want everything about the mind to be in the realm of the empirical.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting the issue. I think is could we ever empirically discover that we were zombies? And your feeling, I guess, is yes, or is this a purely philosophical issue at that point?
I say my feeling is that I think everything about the mind is in the realm of the empirical. I don't think we have any grip on the mind that isn't theoretical.
So you don't. So you really are saying that there's no. So this idea that there's an antecedent common sense point of view, then we fix the data and then go and discover what those things really are. That's
isn't that a rather outdated philosophy of science there?
It's outdated. In what way?
Well, isn't it a bit inductivist? I mean, we start with the sort of the pure data, and then we go and theorize about it later. That's not how we do science, is it? Observation is theory informed. Why isn't it with the mind?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're making good points, and in general, I agree with all these points. In the back, but I mean, maybe this is the sense in which there's something unique about conscious experience, and that may be, and maybe that's what the ultimate problem is, or excuse me, the ultimate divide here is those between the real divide is not between physicalists and dualists or whatnot, but perhaps between those who think that there's something unique about conscious experience and those who think that there's nothing unique about it. And typically people who say there's something unique about it also end up saying that it's not naturalizable in some sense. But I don't see, it doesn't seem to me that one's forced that way simply by recognizing that there's something, well, I don't want to say metaphysically special, but there's something epistemically special about conscious experience.
Well, it's those people in the middle that I'm trying to put pressure on. You see.
Right.
There's people who want to have their phenomenal cake and eat it. You know,
yeah, exactly.
I want to press. Okay.
So let's go ahead and examine the pressure then. We've already sort of touched on some of this stuff, but what's the problem with the diet notion? Why can't I have and eat my cake?
Well, I don't have an argument against it. It's what I have as a challenge. Explain this to me. Help me to get a grip on this notion.
Right.
And what I do in the paper, insofar as there is an argument, it's this. Look, I understand what the classic notion is. I can understand what you're saying, that there's some intrinsic, ineffable feel to experience that goes way beyond its functions and the associated reactions and dispositions and discriminatory abilities, and it just feels like something.
Right.
And this is just, there's no way I can convey this feel to you directly. No way I can be sure that you have the same feel that I do when you experience the same thing. It's essentially private. It's subjective, and it's intrinsic. I could imagine all the reactions, the dispositions, the functions, everything being replicated, and this field being different or not existing at all, as in the case of a zombie. So okay, I've got an idea. I've got a grip on that. And then what I do is I introduce another notion, which I haven't mentioned yet, which is what I call, following this soft drink metaphor, I call zero qualia. Now, zero qualia are dispositional properties of experience. They're the properties that dispose us to think, to judge that the experience has classic qualia.
Right.
So to say that an experience has zero qualia is to say that it's such that I dispose to think that it has this ineffable, intrinsic, private feel. Okay, and so I know what zero qualia are. I understand that, and I think they exist. I'm sure they exist. I think everyone agrees that zero qualia exist. that we really do have these dispositions to make classic qualia judgments. So okay, so I know what classic qualia are. I don't think they exist, but I know what they are. I know what zero qualia are. Now, diet qualia are supposed to be something in between. They're not just... There's something more than mere zero qualia. I take it that people who believe in diet qualia think that an experience could have zero qualia. It could be such as to dispose you to think that it has classic qualia without actually having any feel to it, any phenomenal character, any what it is like us. That's how it's supposed to be with zombies. So they're supposed to be something more than mere zero qualia. But they're supposed to be something less than classic qualia. They're not necessarily intrinsic, ineffable, essentially subjective. They may just turn out to be functional properties of the brain, representational properties of experiences. And so they occupy this middle ground.
Right.
And I'm just not clear that there is anything. There is a conceptual space there.
Uh-huh. So let me just ask you quickly. I mean, so you say this in the paper, but just to be clear, sometimes zero qualia are diet qualia. So it's...
Well, they could be classic qualia.
They could be classic qualia, right. So it might be the case that the property that disposes me to judge that I have classic qualia are in fact the classic qualia themselves.
Qualia, yeah.
But of course, there's nothing in the definition of the zero notion that entails that, since that's what the zombie idea is supposed to get at. That, well, if you could really have the zombies, they just have the zero qualia, and so there's some other property which is disposing the zombies to make the judgments that they do.
Yeah. So we could use the term merely zero for zero qualia that don't have any other kind of qualia.
Right. So now let me also let me ask you this other question. So I like the basic argument that the weak notion must ultimately collapse into either the classic notion or the zero notion, so that ultimately there's no stable middle ground. You're either a zombie or what Dave Bisecker has called an angelic being with non-physical consciousness. So you're one of the other, and there's no stable position. But is your notion... oh, sorry, that's the dog barking. Frankie, she's normally sleeping at this point.
That's okay.
Frankie, go lay down. They'll edit this out. they won't. Okay, so Frankie, stop. I wanted to ask if this was an epistemic notion or a metaphysical notion of the diet qualia that we have here. So do you think that diet qualia are supposed to occupy some ontological category? And so, because that seems wrong to me, it seems to me that the diet notion is an epistemic notion, and that the other two ultimately are metaphysical. I mean, are picking out something in the world or not. Whereas diet qualia aren't meant to do that. They're meant to, as a way for us to epistemically figure out what things we're going to be nailing down metaphysically later.
That's interesting. Given the way the distinction is introduced in the literature, and we've already talked about that, I think it is treated as an ontological notion, isn't it?
Well, yeah. It shouldn't be, though, right?
It's treated as the explanandum for a theory of consciousness,
right? Or as the way of picking it out.
Well, wouldn't zero qualia serve as that?
Well, they might not, given the zombie notion. So that's why the zero qualia is too weak for the... Well, I mean, look, it's going to turn... So here's the kind of point that I'm making is just that... of course, metaphysically, there's only one or the other of the classic or the classic or the zero qualia here, right? Metaphysically, it's one or the other. There's merely zero or there's classic. But the diet notion is perhaps just a way of epistemically sort of saying, this is what we're going to try to figure out which one is giving us these diet intuitions, the merely zero or the classic.
Well, I think I'd be fairly happy with that, but I don't think that's how it's treated in the literature. I mean, because what we get are theories reductive theories of diet qualia, not under that name. We get reductive theories of phenomenal appeal, phenomenal character, phenomenal properties.
Right. So this is where the diet qualia, zero qualia shuffle comes in.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, we can talk about that.
So this might be a good place to bring that up,
Yeah.
because I want to press this epistemic metaphysical distinction later. But first, so let's say, yeah, I agree with you. It's treated like an ontological category. Here's a thing we're going to be explaining.
Property, yeah.
So that's why it sounds ontological, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then in the course of trying to explain what that is, though, inevitably people start shuffling towards one of the extreme notions, either towards the zero notion or towards the classic notion. And so that's part of your evidence that there's no stable middle ground. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, the evidence comes in two forms. One is that I just look at various suggestions as to how we might get a grip on this notion and argue that none of them really works. And then the second is I look at some examples of theories of diet qualia and argue that what's really being explained there is zero qualia, and that the theories get their plausibility from explaining our dispositions to judge that experiences have classic qualia.
Right.
So what you'll find is, I say what you'll find, that's a little arrogant, but what I think typically happens is that people, a typical reductive theory of consciousness tends to go like this, where we begin with a distinction between the classic and the diet notion, then some theoretical apparatus is wheeled in. It might be first order representational theory, higher order representational theory, and the theory is justified by showing that someone who instantiated this particular the mechanisms postulated there would tend to think that their experiences had intrinsic ineffable subjective fields.
Right.
But then, of course, all that's being explained is zero qualia.
Right.
And I offer a few perhaps rather unfair quotations in the paper to illustrate this, but I do think it's a pervasive move. And if you think about it, it's not really clear that anything else could be explained in these terms. I mean, this is a point that dualists like to bang on about, that how can you get any kind of I mean, these theories are typically couched in representational or functional terms. How can you get any representational or functional hook on something as elusive as phenomenal character and what it is likeness? So what you get a hook on, of course, is are the dispositions to think that experiences have classic qualia.
Right.
And that's, I think, what typically gets explained. So you start off with diet qualia as your target, but you offer a theory that really gets its plausibility from explaining zero qualia.
Right. Right. And I guess you feel it goes the other way for the property dualists as well, if they ultimately end up explaining the classic notion rather than the diet notion?
Well, I think what happens there is that the thought experiments used to support a property dualist position tacitly assume the features of classic qualia. I think the reason that we think that zombies are conceivable is not it's not that we find zombies conceivable and then come to the conclusion that qualia are intrinsic. I think it's because we start off with the conception of them as intrinsic. We find zombies conceivable.
Right. Now that's that move I'm very sympathetic to. It's interesting that Dave is adamant about denying that this is the way that the zombie argument works. So I think that's interesting. That on the one hand he simply says, no, look, we start off as just merely conceiving of something, whereas on our side says, no, you've already assumed that those things have to be that way. That's why you can conceive them. There seems to be just a dead stalemate there. I think that would make an interesting separate kind of discussion of what can be done about that, or what kind of argument you could really give towards showing that's actually true, that the zombie argument assumes already that these things are non-physical or something.
I mean, I think that's why property dualists need the diet notion. You see, my suggestion, I mean, slightly arrogant suggestion, is what the diet notion is doing. It's playing a strategic role,
right,
in facilitating certain kinds of positions. So, I mean, you just explained why it's useful for the property dualist, so that it doesn't seem they're building in assumptions that they're later going to rely on argumentatively. And it's useful for the physicalists because it allows them to give the appearance of really engaging with the hard problem, of taking consciousness seriously.
Right.
If you're a type A materialist, then you can be dismissed as not taking consciousness seriously.
Right.
If you accept that diet qualia exists, then okay, you're on board. You're engaged with the real mystery, and then you're solving it. Okay, which seems good. So in a way, I think my complaint here, and perhaps I see more clearly now why someone like Dave Chalmers really wants the notion of diet qualia, is that it's kind of letting the property dualist set the terms of the debate,
right,
and it's performing that function perhaps.
Yeah, it really, and I mean, I've heard this complaint before, so that it really sets up the problem so that we're destined to fail, you know.
Yes.
I mean, so I want to go back to this thing I was talking about earlier. The shuffle here seems to me, I mean, so here, let me put it this way. At the beginning of our discussion, you said the notion was introduced as a neutral explanand, something that we can target without begging any questions, and then the property dualist can go on to argue that it has these certain features, and the materialist can go on to argue that it has these other features, but that this diet notion is the middle ground, which is common between them. So I wonder why the shuffle isn't merely them doing that explanation. Right. So, I mean, you agreed that that's what, I mean, you started out saying that's what was going to happen, that they're going to start with this neutral notion and then try to explain it. And so why isn't it the case that after, so as Carruthers or is doing the shuffle towards the diet notion, the zero notion, saying, well, I'm just, having this will cause or dispose me to make these judgments, and that's all that we could ask for. Why isn't he then just doing what you said he was going to do?
Well, look, I think there's two different ways of well, no, hang on. I mean, that's not the idea, is it? I mean, the idea isn't that we start with diet qualia and then kind of discover that actually they're nothing more than merely zero qualia. That's not it. The idea is that we start with diet qualia, and diet qualia really, damn well exist, but it turns out that they're not intrinsic, ineffable, subjective, and so on. But they still exist. They're still more than merely zero qualia. There still is this feel there, and it's something that's distinct from. It's at least conceptually distinct from the dispositions. So what you find that these type B people saying is, yes, there is a distinct fact here. There's the fact about the feel. Now that fact may be explicable in functional representational terms, but it's not itself a functional representational fact. It's something else. Right.
Now, so someone like Bloch, for instance, who thinks that the phenomenal characters just turn out to be certain kinds of brain activity. So, for instance, he thinks motion perception may be some kind of recurrent loop in between the medial temporal areas and B1 or something like that. That it's this feedback kind of loop going on there, but that there's no explanation for why that is. It's just identities are brute, and if that's what you find out, then that's what you find out. Now, is that kind of you doing a shuffle as well? Because it doesn't seem, I mean, he's saying there's no explanation, it's just that you
No, I don't think that is doing the shuffle. I think the one way you can get out of doing the shuffle is by positing a brute identity.
And then so you could still have your diet notion, though, because he starts out saying, look, I just want to talk about these things which I access in my introspection, and then those things turn out to just be this brain activity. You can't explain why, that's just the way the world is. You're done.
No, look, I think the shuffle is done by people who offer reductive explanations.
Okay.
If you want to posit brute identities, then I think you're okay. I mean, I still don't think the diet notion is a sound one, but you can have the diet notion and not do the shuffle. You do the shuffle when you try to offer a reductive explanation of it.
Right.
Okay. So no, I don't think Bloch's doing the shuffle. I think he's actually more clear-headed in this, but I don't like brute identities.
Right. So, well, I mean, in a sense, they're brute, but in a sense, they're well, they're licensed on Block's view by overall explanatory power gained by positing the brute identity. So it's, I mean, you get something for them. I mean, so take the identity between water and H2O. It allows us to explain the way that water behaves, and it gives us a better explanation than not positing the identity. So, I mean, overall, in the giant scheme of things, you can see, well, these two sets of properties are correlated. If we assume, if we sort of just identify them, then we get more explanatory power down the line. So I agree that, and there are other, I mean, there are other, depending on how rationalist you are, there are other even stranger results that Dave has talked about. You know, I don't think we need to get into those issues here, but so there are prices to pay for this kind of brute identity move, but there are also advantages to it, and it might just be the way things turn out, and that would be one way of keeping the diet notion, I think, though. And so right,
it would be a way of keeping the diet notion without doing the shuffle. Yes,
that's right. And so then you would wonder, well, why is the diet notion vacuous then?
Well, let's say the argument against the diet notion isn't so much that you have to do the shuffle if you buy into it. It's that I can't get a grip on it at all. And you know, there's some considerations in the paper, for instance, about you know, how we identify diet qualia. We have a huge difference of opinion about what we can introspect, between people who, what I call transparentists and non-transparentists, people who think that we can introspect properties of experiences themselves, and people who think that we are only aware of properties of the objects of our experiences. That's a huge difference, and it seems to me that that throws a huge spanner in the works of anybody who thinks that there's this completely uncontroversial, intuitive notion of diet qualia.
Right. Well, and that's an interesting other side note, right?
Of other lines of attack on diet qualia.
Right. And in fact, the experimental philosophers have been engaging in that line of attack, trying to show that actual ordinary, you know, people who are non-corrupted by philosophy, they don't seem to have the diet notion. Absolutely.
And anyone who's taught introductory philosophy of mind knows that how tricky it can be to infect people with this.
Right. I mean, that's one thing I guess I'll say is I find it's tricky at first, but I think that if you, by talking about, you know, inversion cases, I think the inversion cases really, once they, I mean, it takes a minute for them to see, well, yeah, how could that? We both call it blue if you see yellow when I see what I see. But eventually, I mean, they do get it intuitively. Oh,
sure.
Right.
Sure, I'm not denying there's not a predisposition to get it there, but it needs a little bit of theoretical leverage, and I just don't. Even the, you know, I mean, I have accepted from the start that there is this strong intuition, but even the intuition, I think, is not pure.
Right.
It needs a bit of leverage. And just to go back to the thing that you were mentioning earlier about the epistemic and ontological readings of the notion of diet qualia.
Yeah.
I think if you take the notion of, if the use you have of the notion of diet qualia is this, if you say, look, we're inclined to talk about the feel of experience, we're inclined to do this, okay. Now, should we cash that out in some sort of ontologically expensive way in terms of classic qualia, or should we we go for some minimalist notion like zero qualia? Fine, that's no problem with that at all.
Okay.
In fact, that's exactly what I think we should do, and we do have this way of talking. I've no problem with that. It's whether the way of talking picks out some third thing.
Right. I think that's really the issue that you want to highlight is does the diet notion pick out a third thing? And I think, you know, actually I think if you just focus on the epistemic kind of notion that we're talking about, I think even people, property dualists like Dave, will say that's all I meant really, was that there's this epistemic notion, and then I think that it happens to pick out the classic conception. Whereas the other people like Ned and Type B people think it picks out something else. But that we both agree that there's this epistemic characterization that we're interested in. But no third thing. There's one or the other.
I'm not convinced about that. I'm really not. But if you look at the way this is if you look at some of the quotations I give at the beginning of the paper from Carruthers and I think from I think there's one from
there's one from Ty.
And one from Tim Crane possibly.
Yeah.
I think they are identifying this as property that needs explaining, and they then go on to offer substantive theories of this property,
Right.
of how experience has come to possess this property. Perhaps not every. I mean, perhaps it should be a lot more clear, but I do think they're treating it ontologically.
Right. Well, that might be
a
a
lot
mistake.
of persuading that they're doing the other thing.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I think that's interesting. You know, I noticed it's getting on in time here. Before we run out of time, though, I wanted to circle back all the way around and talk about something else that we have in common, which is our use of anti-conceivability arguments or parity arguments against the dualist. So, you know, I was led to the idea of physical duplicates that have conscious experience through a debate I had with Richard Chappell on my blog over zombies. And then as I was writing this up, I discovered that you had beat me to the punch by about a year or so. And then, I mean, also lots of other people have sort of hit on this idea as well. Cody Baylog, for instance, and Sturgeon. Gualtiero Piccinini, by the way, also has an unpublished paper where he talks about this. But so I mean, we're all physicalists. We all ultimately think that all there is the physical stuff. And as a way of dealing with conceivability arguments, we've all sort of said, well, look, we can conceive of purely physical things that have conscious experience.
Yep.
And those, now we use them slightly differently. So you're interested in severing the connection between conceivability and possibility, whereas I'm more interested in trying to show that zombies probably may not be conceivable in the first place. So I think we use these kinds of thought experiments differently. But I mean, the issue that arises here is, what is it that you're conceiving if you don't have the dyad notion? So what does the anti-zombie world look like? What is it that you're really envisioning if you don't have a notion of dyad qualia?
Yeah. Well, first of all, tactically, the paper is addressed. My paper is addressed to people who use the zombie argument. So.
Right.
It doesn't matter really whether I think the anti-zombie argument is a good one. The question is whether it relies on the same assumptions about the links between conceivability and possibility that the zombie argument does.
Right.
So if my opponents are happy to endorse its premises, then that's fine for me. I don't really need to endorse them myself.
Right. So then you're saying you don't find it, or are you saying
I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it wouldn't matter if I didn't. It's a challenge to my opponents rather than something that I need to endorse myself. But secondly, I don't see why I have a problem with conceiving of the anti-zombie world. It's a world that's exactly like this one, that doesn't have any non-physical stuff in it. Right.
So I've called that world the shambi world, but I think where we're differing though is someone might, after listening to this conversation and then hear this, say to you, "Gee, isn't the anti-zombie world just the zombie world?" But you're saying they're conscious. Whereas I think the shambi world isn't. I think that because I can endorse the dyad notion, I think that when I'm conceiving of the shambi world, I really am conceiving of a world where there is conscious experience, not the zero notion, but the dyad notion, and that it's not non-physical, so it's purely just a physical.
So you are now using the dyad notion in an ontological sense, right?
Well, I'm using it as a way of picking out the same stuff. So I think it's still an epistemic sense.
So it could be that all you're conceiving of is merely zero qualia picked out via the notion of dyad qualia.
It could be that I'm conceiving of merely zero qualia picked out by the. I don't think. I mean, so do you think I could be that one could be that confused in what they're conceiving?
I don't know. It sounded like you were saying something like that.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that at the Shambi world, there's consciousness just the way that it is here,
Yeah,
but that it's physical. But where that's not merely saying that it's zero.
Well, so you're just so this world couldn't be one where there's just zero.
That's right. I think it's impossible.
So then it does seem that you're using the Dike notion in an ontological sense. You're thinking there's something more than merely zero. Right?
I think, yeah. In fact, I think there's classic qualia. I mean, this is what we're getting at the beginning. I think I don't, and I think that someone like we've been talking about, for instance, this whole conversation, someone like Bloch will accept that. Well, for the most part, classic qualia are almost the way that we thought they were. They're not functional. They're just identical to certain brain activity. They're not effable. We can't really say what they are. They're unique, but they're just physical.
Yeah,
and that's the type B position, really, isn't it? I mean, isn't that really, that's just type B physicalism?
Well, yes, it depends. I mean, a lot of type B people, actually, I don't think, I mean, this is quite a tricky issue, so we're probably not going to sort it out here, but I think the way Chalmers uses the type B, introduces the type B notion, it goes along with brute identities.
Uh-huh.
But you'll find a lot of people who kind of look like type B people, because they appeal, say, to features of our phenomenal concepts and explaining the zombie intuitions, yet then go on to offer reductive explanations of consciousness.
Right.
Which is a sort of, seems like a kind of intermediate position between type B and type A. They're using type B mechanism, apparatus to disarm the zombie argument and the arguments from inverts and so on, and Mary.
Right.
But then they're giving a more or less standard functional representational explanation of Dike qualia, and I think that's now that may not be a confused position, but it's a position that doesn't fit easily into the type A type B terminology.
Yeah, no,
so
I
something
agree.
Actually, I think needs sorting out, and one of my general complaints, I think, about this debate is that for too long now it's been kind of dominated, naturally, by the apparatus that Dave Chalmers introduced in the mid-90s. Now, understandably, I mean, he's a brilliant guy. It's a brilliant book. It's set the terms. It's revivified this whole debate.
Right.
It's created a huge research program. It's really been, I think, quite really good for philosophy of mind.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I agree.
But I think it's about time that some of it was dismantled.
Right. I mean, those of us who are sort of attracted to the Quinean picture, I think that this is for the best, right? What we want are competing theories.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that what Dave has done is to generate a rival competing theory that focuses a lot of issues and makes extremely clear what the options are. And we should evaluate a theory on its theoretical merits.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's, I think, where the benefit comes from.
Yeah, I agree.
We don't have a straw man anymore. We have an actual position to engage with. So there are issues with whether it's whether those outside philosophy, like in the scientific world, whether these kinds of arguments help or hurt the image of philosophy. So a lot of times, those that I know that are scientists will say things like, oh, you philosophers wasting your time talking about zombies all the time. We should be looking at data. And I think that's a misconception, because I think that this kind of theory building and thinking about, even if you're a rabid foaming at the mouth empiricist, like I tend to be sometimes, even empiricists should be interested in rationalist theories, because all we have are theories. And it may turn out that rationalism is true. If you're an empiricist, right? I mean, you have to take a theory on its merits. So I think it's wrong, especially for someone who likes empiricism, to dismiss these kinds of theories out of hand. So I do think that
absolutely. I wouldn't do that. I do think that we need an anti-Dave Chalmers to write the zombie mind, I think. So.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, that's what my paper on this, I called deprioritizing the a priori arguments. Yeah. I originally was going to call it the two-dimensional argument against property dualism, but because I think I really do think that if you take the apparatus that's there already, and it doesn't force you to property dualism. So Dave thinks,
No,
look,
sure.
if you adopt this kind of view, then you can see that physicalism is false. Whereas that's what I think the Shambi argument shows, though, is that we can't see yet which one. Even if you accept that conceivability entails possibility, we don't know which of these is conceivable. In fact, we're in the dark, which is why we need to focus on empirical results at this point. And I think that what we really are going to see is, well, whether we eliminate things or whether we discover the neural natures of these things, those are empirical questions, and we're just going to have to wait for more data. So I think, like, for instance, the work on pain asymbolia is going to turn out to be extremely important. And those kinds of things, which seem to suggest that maybe, so for, those who don't know, pain asymbolia is the condition where people say they feel pain, but they don't think that is painful. And that, at first blush, seems to be what's really going on there. They say, it hurts. They say it feels like a pinprick. They say this one hurts more than that one. But at the same time, they say, well, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't cause me discomfort. I don't want to withdraw my hand. So if it's the empirical kind of results that show where our intuitions are misguided, I think, and ultimately our intuitions will be 500 years from now will be very different, I think, than.
I hope so.
And that's, of course, the heart of the eliminativist, non-eliminativist debate. The question is, with the different conceptual apparatus, are we going to have to get rid of some of these old ones or not? And I think that, I don't know. I'm just not a Churchlandian about this. I don't think that, I think the reason why folk psychology has been unchanged since Aristotle's days is because it works, because it's accurate, and so on.
Well, it certainly works, but
Right.
I think eliminativism has to be on the table. I think if
Right.
you're going to start with a view that rules it out, then I think you're handicapping yourself.
Right. And that's why I think that the epistemic notion of the diet stuff isn't, because it could turn out that really all there is the zero notion, and that would be eliminativism.
Yeah, I'd be happy with this. I mean, I think you probably need the zero notion yourself I mean, what you do with those cases of pain in asymbolia and the dental pain case, the fake pain case, you have cases where you have, I think as you put it, you have pain without the painfulness in the pain asymbolia, and you have painfulness without the pain in the dental case. Is that right?
Yes.
And I mean, obviously, what a property dualist is just going to leap on you and say, well, yes, but it's the painfulness I'm talking about, not the pain. That's
right. Well, but the point, though, of you're right. They say that all the time, but that's to miss the point slightly, I think, of the argument, which is that, look, we have an intuition that the painfulness and the pain can't come apart, but empirical data shows that, in fact, they do. So it's supposed to put pressure on this idea that, look, I just know that pain is a simple thing that can't come apart, and that pain is painfulness, and painfulness is pain. And this is the cryptic idea that, look, how could I be and have the painfulness? But yet, when we go into the finer detail and do the science, it turns out these do come apart. And then, so how much should we trust our intuition that you can't have pain?
I'm sure you could easily press lay people on this and say, is the dental pain person really feeling pain? I mean, you could press them on whether painfulness and pain really do. And I'm sure you could get intuitions going both ways on this.
You're right. No, absolutely. Yeah.
And so maybe what you need, I mean, painfulness, zero qualia works great. You can certainly have the zero qualia without the pain sensation in the sense that you're using the term. And I think ultimately that's the way. I think that's the way that you need to push that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I would think they really do have the painfulness, but they just don't have the pain sensation. So I think they really do have they really are in pain in a sense. They're in conscious pain in exactly the same way as a person who would normally be in conscious pain. It's just that they don't have the pain sensation.
I think all you're going to do there is just get an intuition swapping going off.
Right.
I think you're going to be able to crank up one set of intuitions on one side and another set on the other side, and there's no way of resolving it. You can only resolve that theoretically, I think. Yeah,
I go back and forth on this issue. I think that's an important point that you're raising, and I swing like a pendulum as between whether this can be decided empirically or whether it has to be decided at a philosophical or at least psychological level. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, one that needs a lot more attention. I wish people would talk about pain asymbolia more, actually. I think it's...
they're absolutely, they're very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, of course, they're sort of meat and drink to first-order representationalist theories, these kind of cases.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Tari, for example. Yeah.
Oh, gee, I noticed that, wow, we've been going for almost 2 hours at this point. I feel like we could go all day.
An hour, I think. Have we?
Oh, it's an hour. Oh,
an
it's...
hour, I think.
Oh, has it been? Okay, it just feels like forever.
Phenomenally, yes.
Yeah.
You were just commenting on what the scientists' attitude to this, and I'll just mention what a cognitive psychologist said to me once. He said, "Look, the one thing we wanted you philosophers to sort out about the mind was consciousness, and you haven't done it."
We've let them down. I don't know. I disagree with that. I think that we're in the process of sorting it out. I mean, when I started being interested in this in the late 90s, when I was still an undergraduate and coming into graduate school, there was a blooming, buzzing confusion, I think. But I think that conceptually things are getting ironed out. I mean, we haven't solved anything, but I think that debates like the one we're having and Chalmers' contributions and so on. There's so many. We're so much clearer about the conceptual area now. What theories are possible, where you can go, where you can't go, in ways that we weren't in the 10 years ago, 15.
And this
years
is
ago.
the great thing that Dave Chalmers' work has done. It's really it's been really therapeutic for everybody.
That's right. Yeah, and so I think we that the cognitive neuroscientist was a bit unfair. We have been sorting it out, but philosophers move at a notoriously slow pace. We're molasses, but like the hare in Achilles, we will ultimately cross the finish line first.
I'm sure. Okay.
Yeah. So perhaps this is a good point to draw to a close.
Great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed having this conversation with you, Keith. It's been very informative and fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed it very much.
Okay. Well, you have a good day. Is it evening over there where you are?
So is it? It's late afternoon here in Crete.
Okay. Well, it's early morning for me, so on with my day.
Okay. Have a good day.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye then. Take care.